The Promised Django, the tale of one team's epic journey from the country of Flask to Django Land. This is a story in 3 parts. I'm Nicole. Yep, that's me. That one. I'm going to be telling you a story today. This story takes place where I work, a company called Clover Health. We offer health insurance to Medicare-eligible folks who are generally 65 plus or have disabilities that qualify them sooner. And we're trying to improve people's health outcomes and be kind of nice to interact with. We'll start with Chapter 1, Origins. This is our backstory where we meet our characters. We'll then explore what we planned to do and what actually happened, some of the technical challenges, and then do an assessment of our work success. You ready? Yes, Nicole, we're super ready. Cool. Just so you know, this is not going to be a why Django is better than Flask talk. They're both useful tools, so if you were hoping to do some Flask bashing, that's the exit, and I won't blame you if you leave now. Cool, we're in it. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away called Clover Health, the engineering team built an API in Flask. This was the right decision for them at the time. They wanted flexibility to build applications without an external set of opinions shaping the code. They wanted the code to be easy to trace and understand without requiring skills with some third-party framework. And they wanted to use a set of tools that was consistent with the data pipelines and other systems. But over time, the team became very sad because there were too many ways of doing things with no one established pattern for people to follow, and because people ended up rolling their own stuff from scratch. They wrote a lot of boilerplate code day after day, and any new engineer who joined the team still had to learn Flask if they didn't already have experience using it in a production environment. Even worse, they also had to learn how to do things from the SQL Alchemy documentation, which is notoriously evil. It turned out that the APIs the team ended up coding weren't so different from what Django could handle after all. So the engineers got together in small groups and talked about it, and there was much discussion and much disagreement. And then they talked about it some more. I don't know if your engineering team is anything like mine, but there was a lot of talking. And then one day, Paul, who is starring as Nick Fury in this, came to the team with a proposal for how we could transition to Django and show them the path to Django Land. He'd written a proof of concept for a library in Django to make it easier, thought through an initial design of how to accommodate Flask while transitioning to Django, and looked into ways to adding schema support for Postgres. He did all this, but he couldn't make the decision alone. The team needed to pursue it of their own accord. And then there was more discussion. Would moving to Django actually encourage a consistent pattern for building APIs, or would we end up having the same struggles? Would the engineering time saved getting up to speed or writing endpoints using Django REST framework outweigh the time investment it would take to actually port the existing code to Django? And would we have the time and the support to port, or would we be interrupted midway through by some product direction shift? We decided as a team to go for it in this meeting, which is our web apps meeting in apparently March of 2017, time flies. This was our slide deck. James Bennett, who is starring as Vision, and me as Scarlet Witch. I was gonna do Wonder Woman, but I know that someone was gonna complain about like crossing the streams, so Scarlet Witch. We used our Hack Week time to create a Django API repo in April of 2017. And started creating an MVP Django project that would serve new features in Django, but legacy code from Flask. We were able to route requests through Django to Flask and set up a couple of rudimentary endpoints in Django to serve as examples of what pattern to follow. But there was clearly more work than we could accomplish in like 2.5 days of our Hack Week. However, would we accomplish the task we'd set for ourselves? Insert commercial break here. Our 2 intrepid heroes were rescued from the monumental effort by their many friends on the web apps team, who clearly all had to be Avengers and related people. And And we created the Django Stewardship Group for pushing forward the great work. We met every week from April to September, breaking down problems, discussing solutions, volunteering for tasks that would get us there. We did these tasks in our non-project time and collaboratively in like small breakout groups, but this wasn't enough, and we were afraid that we'd never get over the initial development mountain to the land beyond where we'd be able to create new Django apps in peace and prosper. So two of the engineers on the team, Santiago is playing Hawkeye in this, and Rohan is Black Widow, were staffed on this thing that we have called support engineering or reliability support. I'm not sure if you all have this in your organizations, but support engineering was a project that engineers rotated onto for a period of time where they were responsible for like triaging bugs, handling outages, upgrading packages, doing the stuff that isn't like exactly a project. So on their stint on support engineering, they decided to focus a 2-week sprint on moving the Django project closer to the final goal, which is having Django in production, serving endpoints itself, and passing along any requests it can't handle to Flask. They got the support of web apps managers and set out tackling like one hurdle after another. They faced a ton of struggles and setbacks and could probably give their own talk about everything that they went through, but that would take an extra half hour. So suffice to say, they got us like 90% of the way to having Django live in production. And when their sprint was done, the stewardship group took up the mantle again and got us the rest of the way. So TLDR version of how we got started, whole team discussion and alignment. We had Hack Week to get the ball rolling and do like a proof of concept. The stewardship group broke the project down into pieces and bit some off. We got pretty close with a sprint by 2 engineers, which is like really impressive when you think about it. And the stewardship group got us the rest of the way over. So now that you understand where we came from, Chapter 2, the royal plan and the reality, or what we intended and what actually happened. The plan was to port over time, where if you touched the legacy Flask app, port it if at all possible, and include that in your project scope of work. We wanted to make Django flexible enough to handle the way that Flask works so that we're only developing in one system. Let Flask remain as it is. Let's not sink further effort into developing it. Let's make that effort go towards Django. Small updates to Flask app could remain in Flask because it didn't really make sense if you were making like a 2-line code change to port like a whole application. But anything that you were refactoring should definitely be ported to Django at the same time. The reality was we had planned to like find good patterns for incremental porting, but really we ended up just going like, well, make a decision and stick with it, and then we'll see what works well and what doesn't in the end. Greenfield projects, we did ended up writing in our Django API service. Small-ish updates to Flask end up remaining in Flask, although our definition of small and small-ish kind of grew over time. And refactors are ported to Django. We did, in fact, make Django flexible enough to handle the way that Flask works, but we still had to make updates to libraries in Flask, though, that affected projects we couldn't yet port. The plan, request routing. How would Django and Flask work together? Initially, we'd considered having Django import our Flask application and call into views directly, sharing the same uWSGI process. As we thought about it, though, it would be tricky to get the SQL Alchemy database sessions playing nicely with Django sessions for things like automatic rollbacks in the event of a failure of some kind. We wanted to retain atomicity of our transactions, regardless of whether it all happened in Django, all happened in Flask, or a combination of the two. We wanted to do this because we were somewhat worried about potential latency of doing things over the network. But in testing, it ended up being not that bad. So we were like, Django, you are not going to call Flask directly. You're going to do it over the network. So we ended up having both repos independently accepting requests, but everything was routed to Django from our front end. And if Django doesn't know how to handle the endpoint, if they would otherwise return a 404, then it sends that network request to Flask. Flask sends that response back to Django, and Django serves it up to our front end. So here's how it ended up looking. We have all requests coming into the front end. The request payload goes to Django. If Django can handle it, it serves it back to the front end. And if it can't, it asks Flask for whatever it needs. Our plan was unidirectional flow. This was a sanity measure I felt was really important to make it easier for us all to understand the relationship between Django and Flask. Django might ask Flask for data, but Flask could never call into Django to get info. I felt like that way lied madness, especially since they are separate. You could end up in some like recursive call pattern, and you wouldn't know because it wasn't all happening in the same process. So I rather firmly was like, put my foot down. We're going to have unidirectional flow. So that meant that some tools that were used by both Django and Flask, we ported the tool to Django, but still had to maintain it medium term in Flask as well. I believe that duplicated code was easier to reason about than having Flask and Django interdependent and not really understanding those dependencies. I kind of got my way. Mostly. We actually stuck to something. It was kind of a struggle when the tools that were written in Django and someone wanted to use it in Flask. But we stayed strong on this with one exception. When I was giving this talk as like a test run internally to my coworkers, one of them was like, actually, there is a place where we call into Django from Flask, but there's only one. Okay, so I think that's a win. And he wanted to make sure I told you all that, he said, we only did it because those services are slated to be pulled out on their own in the near future. We worked closely with the authors of those services to ensure there were no circular dependencies. And we didn't make the decision lightly. He was very concerned that everyone know that he didn't just go screw your decision. I'm going to make this bidirectional. So that was our one exception. But other than that, we stuck with this decision. It does mean that we still have tools that exist in both locations, though. We plan to use the same database. That way there would be no duplicating data. We'd have one complete source of truth, and it would be less to stand up and maintain. In reality, we did stick with the same database. There was no duplicate data, but we have to keep the structure consistent across the Django and Flask models. We have one source of truth, but many ways to write to a table. There are fewer databases to maintain, but it is somewhat harder to manage it. Some of the challenges were, one of them being schema-aware Django, which, as far as I know, is not a thing that comes out of the box. We had to fake migrations in this kind of gnarly way with this homegrown command we did called safe migrate. That's equivalent to running Django's built-in manage.py migrate your application -- fake. If the table already existed in the database because it was created by Alembic migrations, we had to fake that first migration in Django and say, yes, this table already exists, pretend you ran this. And then all future migrations had to be run through Django as normal. You couldn't create migrations in Flask. So this led to this problem where our local dev environment and particularly setting up our databases look like this. Okay, really, this is what it looks like. You create your Flask migrations, then Django migrations, then Flask fixtures, and then Django fixtures, and then made your fake data. This is the way it started, which is okay, it's just, you do it in one, you do it in the other, you go back and forth, and it's done. But if you look at our makefiles, here's what we have kind of right now. As you can see on line 296, our local DevDB setup and fake data, we run the migrations on Flask with Alembic. and then fixtures on Flask, and then switch to Django to run migrations in Django, and then run fixtures in Django, and then back to Flask where we create random fake data that covers models that are only in Flask. And then you switch back to Django again to run more fake data. And then there's other places where we needed to create fake data too. And it's okay if everything works all right, but it's not exactly desirable, and it's kind of clunky. And it also makes us leave notes like this in our code. It says db init and create db should only be used in Circle CI since it ignores creating the Django fixtures and fake data. And if you don't happen to know this and you run db init or create db, which seem like reasonable commands to run, then you try to load up your app in browser and you're like, it's busted, what's up? So our plan was to have authentication in Django and construct and pass a Flask-like user object to Flask and use the same table defining permissions. In reality, Flask needs the user info for authorization checks, and we needed consistent authentication across Django, Flask, and our other internal tools. We didn't really want to write to a shared user session table for both Django and Flask. So we ended up having Flask and Django have different session tables and move the session info into a JSON Web Token cookie. We were telling Django to use our existing user table, which we built in Flask, which we had to modify in Flask to meet Django's needs. That's what it is. Because Flask still needed all the user information about whether someone's logged in, but also whether they have a given role. And we didn't want to monkey with that in Flask. So like I mentioned in the beginning, make Django handle Flask easier, because we don't really want to monkey with Flask anymore. So we kind of had this implicit phased approach where we'd get this proof of concept, and then we'd get to production serving like one endpoint in Django and everything else in Flask, migrate the tools that underlie most of the projects that we have, and then there'd be a long tail of porting ad hoc projects, and at some point, we'd retire the Flask repo. For an organization that is maybe over-deliberate and consensus-seeking, we wanted to bias towards action, and so we just sort of left it ambiguous. In reality, we ended up kind of doing like just-in-time porting, where like we got to prod, okay, but then engineers were left to their own discretion. There was no real roadmap, and that meant there was no pressure, which is great. I hate pressure, but there's also not a ton of direction, which is kind of sad. So progress ended up being slower. Fortunately, the desire to move off of our Flask app was still strong, but that internal motivating force was the only thing pushing to get stuff done, and there wasn't a lot of structure about optimizing how we ordered things to make that easier. Okay, so how did we make this happen in our organization, you might be asking? We had this voluntary task force that met weekly, where work is done as part of your normal workday, not hero hours at midnight. I'm allergic to hero hours. We had engineering manager support, and we had the explicit conversation where we would say in our stand-up, like, I'm spending half a day today porting such and such project to Django. Acknowledging that if the engineering managers chose to say, oh, this other thing, your project work is more important, please focus on that, that literally migrating to Django would not happen, and we'd be stuck straddling the two things forever. I feel like it was really important to have that explicit conversation. So there's support, and then there's adoption. Some of the ways that we did this were working sessions where we got as many people involved in the port as possible. This was kind of accidental. We ended up maximizing the number of people who are comfortable in the new world early. We had, in our documentation, we had Django projects, how-tos, and views tutorials specifically for our code, because there are 1,000,001 Django tutorials out there, but the difference between like my poll app and what's actually happening in production and what patterns we wanted to use. There's like the Pacific Ocean is between those two. We also had a Slack channel full of knowledgeable people who were happy to help and clear roadblocks for you. There was a GitHub group to review the code once it's ported and make suggestions, and there were office hours where you could get help right away. All right, so 6 months into the project, all the crossed out things were completed. We had authentication, we had our JSON Web Token. It was like an intermediate solution. We were gonna spend more time on it, but we at least got it working. We did like event logging and our internal tool for obtaining attributes about our members, and some basic functionality for logging calls with members. Those are like some big hurdles that we have. We got 90% of the way there for our internal library that tracks our temporal data. We almost got there. Okay, so technical challenges. This is where the plot thickens, right? We ended up with some things that were like too big to port easily. It would have taken being staffed up on as its own project for like a few weeks, just because there were so many moving parts, and having people developing on top of it at the same time was going to be a lot of coordination overhead and probably screw-ups. So we ended up deferring porting some things until later, which meant that anything that relied on those things couldn't be ported either. So those need to be staffed as like separate projects. Migrations are still so gross. That makefile will be the death of me. Our intermediate step of like getting authentication with our JSON Web Tokens was fine to get us off the ground, but we said that we would dedicate time pretty soon after to make an auth project that used it the way that we wanted to, because there's so many ways to go wrong with JSON Web Tokens. And we didn't end up staffing it for like 2 years. So it's done now, so like you can relax, but it took us a heck of a long time. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So there's some projects that work fine in Flask as they are and don't need to be touched. So they never make it to getting ported. We also had to balance the business needs and expedience with the desire to write only in Django, and especially with an empathic group of engineers, we want to accomplish the goals that are going to make people's lives easier. But we also have this technical debt that we really want to handle. So that walking that line has been consistently a challenge. And then over time, the team generally arrived at the idea that microservices would make our lives better. There was so much tied up in one monolith and made things too interdependent. It made teams really reliant on each other to ship early and often. And no, we weren't living under a rock before then. We were just figuring out the shape of how we were going to differentiate ourselves from other Medicare Advantage health insurance plans before then. So now that we had a better idea of what that looked like, it made more sense to start breaking things out into smaller separate services. So what happens to our beautiful API? Will it survive? It turns out, yes, it's okay. It's alive and with us today. We have tons of rights to the repo, regular deploys. It spawned a lot of patterns that we ended up using when we began breaking out little baby Django services, or little microservices. You're so cute with their chubby cheeks. Some of my coworkers created this library that's called Temple Django. That's like a project template to help ensure that future microservices use Django, follow some best practices and patterns, and like Sphinx docs and stuff like that. So we've definitely learned from our work with the Django API service for breaking out into microservices. And we definitely benefit from the speed of writing Django ORM queries instead of SQL Alchemy, or at least I do. And we get all the confidence of Django, like security out of the box. There are some drawbacks, however. Some things may always live in Flask, and this complicates our dev environments, and we have to run both at the same time. That complicated fixture and fake data situation, that still makes me cranky. And surprise, Django also has many ways to write views. Shock. Some patterns we still don't use out of the box Django way for example, for a unit test, even though part of the reason why we ported was to have opinions that were not ours, which is just like someone say, here is the way that we do it. So where does that leave us now? We're still supporting both. We're having thorough conversations about when it's the right time to refactor, which is great and everything. We're not complaining all the time about the proliferation of patterns, which I think is pretty great. And I'm not sure if that's because we have like bigger fish to fry or if we've actually solved the problem, but yay, not griping about the same things. Personally, I'm spending a lot less time Googling SQL Alchemy ORM documentation, which makes my life better. So if I had any suggestions for you, it would be get buy-in from ground level and management. It doesn't work if you don't have everyone on the same page from both sides. Rewriting all in one push wasn't going to work for us, but it's useful to have the conversation. Know what you're getting into. We knew that going into it that this was not going to be like a 6-month thing. This was going to be like, hey, we might still have Flask in 3 years thing. And so knowing that makes me not feel super bad that like 2.5 years later, we're not off Flask. It's not like a failure on my part. I suggest you be explicit about the roadmap. That would have been helpful, I think. And spread the knowledge around. The more people who can be comfortable in your new framework while you port, the better. So where do we go from here? Do we call this a success? Personally, I think it's a success in progress. We're seeing meaningful changes on the things that were bothering us before. We haven't wasted time or resource importing things that don't need to move or sinking time into something that wasn't a good fit. Since already things are easier to build than they were before, even though we haven't totally ported, I think that's a good sign. We do have some added complications and wrinkles, but they're pretty small potatoes and are kind of livable tech debt. Had we not set the expectation up front that this is going to take a long time, I'd maybe feel differently about the fact that we're 2 years in and still working on this, but knowing what the priorities were up front, which is keep doing product work, maintain work-life balance, and do this sustainably, precluded worry about not doing it fast enough. The work is still going on though, so maybe in a couple of years we'll regret some of these choices and I'll report back. If this sounds like a fun thing to spend your time thinking about, come work with me. Not with her. That position has been filled. I'm her coworker. But you can come work at Clover Health, shaping the future of tech. We're hiring engineers, of course, in Hong Kong and also remote from all over the US, and we do have an office here. So if you're interested in that, you know who to talk to. Thank you very much.